Greg Kaminsky is the host of the wonderful Occult of Personality podcast, and we are pleased to present this talk on alchemy in colonial New England, recorded live at Knights Templar Oasis in Salem, Massachusetts.
Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law.
So tonight's presentation is Alchemy in Colonial New England. Just to give you a little bit of background, I am a graduate student at Harvard Extension School in Medieval Studies, and I took a class on witchcraft. He gave us a lot of leeway with our final project, and I told him I wanted to write about alchemy in New England. And he suggested that there was this professor named William Newman, who he'd worked with in the past. And you can see he's written this book called Gehenical Fire, The Lives of George Starkey. Now, I've been interested in alchemy in its various forms for many years, but I'd never heard of George Starkey or William Newman. However, I had heard of Irenaeus Philolethes. Well, that's what Newman claims. In this book, he claims that Starkey wrote under the name Irenaeus Philolethes. And Philolethes published probably, I think you can make a good argument with they're the most influential alchemical books of all time, I think. And they were significant because they influenced people like Sir Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and the true forerunners of modern science and chemistry. So, to me, that was a big revelation, and I figured this is probably a subject I needed to look into more, and forms the basis for this research paper that I wrote. I also want to mention I do a podcast called Occult of Personality. If you're not already aware, it's at occultofpersonality.net. And there's interviews there on the subject of alchemy for people who are interested in checking it out. So just to begin, I want to talk a little bit about what is alchemy, because I feel like over time and in various places, it's meant different things. So, in general terms, I'm going to define alchemy as the study of nature and natural philosophy through the agency of chemistry, positing that matter has the potential to evolve to greater states of being over time. So this is a process of purification, and it means that the gross or lesser part must die off in order for the greater part to be reborn. And alchemy is believed to be a practice that aids nature to more rapidly achieve perfection that it's already sort of striving towards, but at a much slower rate. Alchemical philosophy accepts the Hermetic doctrine of the microcosm and the macrocosm. I think that's important. I think we're probably all familiar with the idea from the Emerald Tablet. And it's been asserted in alchemical texts that the perfection of the alchemist's soul is a worthy and necessary goal of the operations that they're undertaking, which is an important distinction from simply doing chemistry or doing experiments in a lab. The European alchemical tradition has undergone somewhat of an evolution, although it's not as distinct as it has been in other places. So the first stage, I think we could call, is just moving from east to west, where you have alchemical tradition, alchemical texts, and knowledge moving from the Arab lands, the Holy Land, into Europe. This was facilitated by the translation of a text called the Turba Philosophorum, which was the first text translated into Latin, originally in Greek, then Arabic, and then in Latin. And there are also texts by Geber, Raymond Lull, or Lully, and Bernard of Trevisan. And this first stage was really just a migration of the knowledge, and this is like the 12th through the 14th centuries. And in Islamic lands, where alchemy was practiced many centuries before it arrived in Europe, it went through 3 distinct stages. These stages were separated by time. In the West, they're not as separated. I think you'll see these stages kind of occurring simultaneously in the West, which is part of what makes defining alchemy so difficult. So in Arab lands, the first stage you have is laboratory operations intended to purify metals, resulting in the production of the Philosopher's Stone. This was seen as a necessary learning experience, but ultimately a dead end. So then you have a second stage, which is spiritual practices that are designed to purify the soul of the alchemist, veiled in the language and symbolism of the laboratory work, and may have been mimicked to some extent by laboratory operations, but not, the laboratory operations weren't the goal of the work. It was more of the inner alchemy. This is a very Gnostic, theosophical, with a small t type of perspective on this subject, and ultimately this didn't last in Islamic lands. I don't know if that's just because they felt it was a dead end, or Islam in general wasn't conducive to this outside of certain Sufi sects. But it moved into a third stage, and I think a lot of this makes sense if you look at alchemy from a history of science perspective. The third stage is what is called iatrochemistry, or medical alchemy. This is alchemy designed to produce substances to treat illnesses and promote bodily health, like the idea of the elixir of life. This turned out to be the most productive and successful stage of alchemy. And this is where you see people like Geber, the famed alchemist, as well as a lot of famous Islamic physicians, Razi or al-Razis, and many other physicians were practitioners of alchemy. So again, going back to the stages of alchemy and development in Europe, we have knowledge coming from the Arab lands up until the 14th century. And after that, you have a stage that I would call Paracelsusm. This is brought about by Paracelsus, who lived from 1493 to 1541. He revived a lot of the medieval alchemical doctrines, and wrote extensively, traveled extensively, and healed extensively. He offered a religious medical philosophy that advocating treating illnesses primarily with metals and minerals, or substances derived from metals and minerals, which is different from the more medical philosophy that's based on the Greek philosopher Galen, primarily, where it's derived, the medicines are derived more from plants and animals to some extent. Paracelsus and his followers asserted that medicine was fundamentally a spiritual occupation, and that physicians were called by and received their power from God. Paracelsus promulgated the Hermetic philosophy of the microcosm and macrocosm as vital to alchemical doctrine. And religious medical alchemy, in addition to being known as iatrochemistry, was also called Paracelsusm. The Paracelsians' goal was to recover the Prisca Theologia, the Edenic past, when humankind had dominion over nature and lived in harmony with God's will. They stressed the importance of experiment and observation of nature. They viewed minerals and mining as sources of practical knowledge, and they desired the free communication of ideas. Then, after Paracelsus and his followers, there's a third stage of development before we get to this era of colonial America and alchemy. And this third stage I would call Helmontianism, because it's named after Jan Baptist van Helmont, who's a Dutch alchemist. He attempted to build upon the Paracelsian framework because he was not really content with the system set down by Paracelsus, which, if you've read Paracelsus's work, it's not exactly systematic. If you're familiar with scientific or certainly medical texts now, it just doesn't even resemble them at all, in my opinion. So Van Helmont incorporated a biological model of Paracelsus with other models from Geber, the Arabic alchemist. This is called corpuscularism, and I think has to do with theories of matter and how living things are constructed. They obviously, not having microscopes at this point, were theorizing, but corpuscularism, I think, could probably be analogous to the idea of cells and living structures and organs and things. Van Helmont relied upon quantitative input and output of reactions, which was distinctive from Paracelsian tradition. So he had much more of an impact on chemistry as like a formal discipline, simply by incorporating this idea of specific measurements of whatever it is you're working with. So his work serves as an important bridge between Paracelsus and contemporary scientific theory. And the laboratory alchemy being studied and practiced in 17th century America could be categorized as primarily Helmontian, with a philosophical basis in Paracelsusism, Hermetism, and a theological basis in Christianity, Puritanism specifically. And these alchemists in New England were part of a larger network that stretched throughout Europe, and they comprised a pretty thriving tradition. They were linked primarily in correspondence, in the trading of books, in the trading of glassware, and of substances that they used in their alchemical work, and probably in the medicines that they produced as a result. And notably, these alchemists were often, if not always, from the upper classes socially. Ministers, physicians, academics primarily. You might ask, why were the wealthy interested in alchemy? There's a few different reasons. Number one, it was the cutting-edge science of the 17th century. There was no better way to try to examine the basic building blocks of matter. And they saw the study of nature as a holy act. So they felt like not only are we on the cutting edge of knowledge and we're the smartest, most intelligent, but we're doing God's work. So the wealth aspect, I don't know how much that played into it. I'm sure it played into it to some extent. But considering they're already wealthy in the context of their society, I don't know.
They had more time with their hands.
Yeah, a little more time, certainly. Promote better health. There's also the aspect of applying alchemical knowledge to industry, mining, metallurgy, and agriculture as well. So they saw this as really an all-encompassing scientific discipline. Whereas today, looking backwards in time, alchemy looks like to most people, I think, the forerunner of chemistry, maybe including some religious philosophy, but I think to them it was far more of an encompassing discipline. Who were these prominent practitioners of medical alchemy that we're talking about in Connecticut and Massachusetts? There's a number of them. I'm not going to read the list, but just some prominent ones listed were Gershom Bulkeley and his son John, Charles Chauncey, and I think he had 3 sons, Elnathan, Isaac, and Israel, Leonard Hoare, Cotton Mather, and Increase Mather, very prominent ministers. There's also 2 governors that practiced alchemy, John Winthrop the Younger of Connecticut and William Stoughton of Massachusetts, and college presidents that openly practiced alchemy, Leonard Hoare and Charles Chauncey, both of Harvard College, and Ezra Stiles of Yale. I think all 3 of them were ministers as well. And then you had other elite practitioners who were neither college presidents nor ministers. Among them includes Richard Palgrave, a Charlestown physician, George Starkey, we mentioned, John Winthrop, the governor, who was also a fellow of the Royal Society, interestingly enough. So I want to begin talking a little bit about George Starkey. I think you all saw the book here, Gehennical Fire. Again, this is interesting because until the author of this book, William Newman, made this proclamation that Starkey was Irenaeus Philalethes, it was always somewhat of a mystery. I think people suspected certain people, but he's tried to back it up, using historical evidence, comparing writing, comparing the alchemical experiments. He's also conducted his own alchemical experiments, so when he's reading these texts, that he has at least a laboratory understanding of what is being referred to. I think it's open for debate as to, whether there is an inner meaning that is there, and whether or not, if it is there, that he understands it. But that's probably beyond the scope of this presentation. So George Starkey, again, 1628 to 1665. He was born in Bermuda, educated at Harvard College, and he moved to England in 1650. He was noted when he was growing up for being a very keen observer of nature. He had notebooks filled with observation on plants and insects and different things around Bermuda where he grew up. His observation, even on insect life, were revolutionary to some extent because I think at that point in time people believed that insects kind of just materialized out of thin air, and he observed, the flies laying eggs and larvae and maggots and different ways that insects reproduced and that they didn't just appear. So he was brilliant as a young man. I think he went to Harvard. I think it was at like age 16. I could be wrong about that, but it was younger than normal. Now, Harvard at the time, it was primarily a theological institution, but science was part of the curriculum. So Starkey's roommate was named John Allen, and he had a classmate also, John Alcock. They practiced alchemy along with Starkey under the tutelage of this Richard Palgrave, who was a physician in Charlestown. And at Harvard, they studied a book called the Compendium of Physics by Charles Morton. And in this book, it contains a section on transmutation. And it's been suggested this was the genesis for a lot of the alchemical study at Harvard College during this time. And I mentioned Leonard Hoare, who was a Harvard College president and practitioner. He wanted to actually construct a laboratory, an elaborate laboratory on campus. Unfortunately, that did not come to pass. But I think that just goes to show how popular and ingrained into the curriculum alchemy was. In the book, he has a sample of some of the Harvard College theses on alchemy throughout the years. I just want to read through the list because I found this really remarkable, even at these late dates, I think. So 1687, is there a stone that makes gold? Yes. 1693 and 1708, is the cure of wounds by sympathetic powder lawful? Both instances, yes. 1698, is there a magnetic method of curing wounds? Yes. 1698 and 1761, is there a universal remedy? Yes in 1698 and no in 1761. 1701, are there diseases which are not cured by Galen's remedies but only by chemical ones? Yes. 1703, can metals be changed into one another alternately? Yes. 1703, 1708, and 1710, is there a sympathetic powder? All three times yes. 1767, are all bodies, metals, and stones not accepted produced from seed? Yes. And 1771, can real gold be made by the art of chemistry? Yes. So even as late as 1771, students were supposedly proving that alchemy was a real practical discipline. Starkey produced a number of very influential alchemical texts, including one called Ripley Revived, referring to English alchemist George Ripley, Secrets Revealed, or An Open Entrance to the Shut Palace of the King, containing the greatest treasure in chemistry, never yet so plainly discovered. And I have some illustrations of some of these. He also has a German version and French version of the fronts of these books. It's really hard to understate the importance of Starkey if he was in fact Philalethes. Again, these books were probably the most influential alchemical texts of the time. They influenced Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, who was really the father of modern chemistry. And even esoterically, at least laboratory alchemists still consider Philalethes like the greatest adept. And he talks about in The Secrets Revealed, or Open Shut Palace of the King, how Philalethes, came across this secret at, I think it was like age 23, is that right?
23.
Yeah. Which is pretty remarkable, if he's being honest about it. I think that's open for debate a little bit, and I'll come back to that subject after we talk about Winthrop, John Winthrop the Younger. This is a book called Prospero's America by Walter Woodward. Again, another academic book on history of science and history of alchemy. This is probably a more readable, interesting book and less scientifically oriented. But I think Winthrop was probably a more well-rounded individual in general. He was son of the Massachusetts governor, John Winthrop. and fellow of the Royal Society, very well educated. He lived from 1606 to 1676. In addition to being a politician, he was a philosopher and industrialist, as well as an alchemist. He became governor of Connecticut in 1635. He spent his formative years in Europe seeking out brothers of the Rosy Cross, which I think is significant because I am sure he made a lot of very interesting, influential contacts, whether or not he found any actual frauders of the RC. He planned to use alchemical science to industrialize Connecticut and Massachusetts. He played a key role in the witch trials in Connecticut. And he was eulogized by Cotton Mather as Hermes Christianus. Yeah, which I thought was shocking. But there's a number of quotes I want to read. I hope you will indulge me in these, but I think it gets the point across better than I can in my own words. So Woodward is talking about medical alchemy in colonial New England, and he says, one of the ways in which Winthrop moved from a suspect newcomer to the beloved and perennial re-elected governor of colonial Connecticut was through his administering of alchemical medicines. Despite the misgivings of some, most New Englanders came to have a deep appreciation for what they believed were the powerful curative effects of the alchemical medicines dispensed by Winthrop and other alchemical medical practitioners. Christian alchemists held that God had revealed these new medicines to them as a special gift for use in rendering Christian service to their fellow humans. In New England, which had a heightened sense of God's direct intervention into disease as a result of the selective contagion seen during the Indian epidemics, medical treatments deemed to be direct from divine sanction carried special significance. And as one of New England's leading practitioners of alchemical medicine, Winthrop was inundated with medical requests. New London, Connecticut became a hospital town to which patients came from all over New England seeking cures for a host of medical conditions. To help meet the New England-wide demand for his medicines, Winthrop distributed them through a network of female practitioners, elite wives who incorporated Winthrop's color-coded packets of medicines into their own healing services. Both Winthrop and the elite wives distributed the medicines as a Christian service without expectation of payment, a form of benevolence that distinguished them from the male and female doctors who healed for payment, acts of benevolence that further reinforced their family status as community and social and political leaders. Basically, by following his Rosicrucian doctrine, he ingratiated himself to the population to such an extent that he was like beyond reproach, reelected several times as governor, as close to royalty as you can get in that time and place. So he was big into the idea of applying this alchemical knowledge to industry and agriculture. After the discovery of what appeared to be a silver-bearing lead ore mine in Massachusetts in the 1640s, Winthrop worked to build New London, which he wanted to be a new London, where alchemists could collaborate and pursue scientific advances in industry, metallurgy, mineralogy, medicine. So in addition to this lead mine, he established the ironworks and enlisted a number of European alchemists and investors for his alchemical transformation of New England. And he went on, I think, a couple of trips to Europe to try to sell this idea and recruit prominent investors and alchemists. So he bought into this pansophic vision of society. I don't know if you're familiar with Jan Comenius, the Czech philosopher and educator, but he had this idea of pansophism, which is, I think I could best summarize it as the idea that adults should have all knowledge or all education in all subjects and thereby come to the understanding of the entire hierarchy of the heavens and cosmos and the earth and how it all functions as one or all, as the pan. Winthrop definitely bought into this, and I think Comenius's pansophic philosophy was very popular at the time within these alchemical circles, like post-Neo-Rosicrucianism. This ironworks, they had a forge. Sorry, my notes may be out of order here. In Quincy, and I think it used to be Braintree when it was first established, but there was this forge. You probably heard of Furnace Brook or Furnace Brook Parkway. It's named after this furnace, which is actually a historical landmark. There's a bad picture of it from Wikipedia, but that still exists today, and that's Winthrop's iron forge, the first iron forge in America and possibly the New World.
Well, the Saugus was.
Yeah, Saugus was the ironworks.
It's the ironworks, yeah.
Yeah. So you might ask, as I did when I was researching this, how exactly does alchemy and Puritanism fit together? Because when I think of alchemists, I think of some guy in a dark basement somewhere with a furnace going and probably lots of books and Kabbalistic symbols everywhere, and not necessarily the pious church-going type. But I was wrong in that sort of stereotype about it, because this Paracelsian religious medical alchemy very much fit right in with Puritanism, because they felt like they were doing Christian service, that these medicines were somehow a gift from God. All this knowledge was revealed from God, basically because of his favor on them for their piousness and being good Christians, essentially. And I think the public's approval for their medical activities kind of reinforced this. So it really complemented rather than challenged Puritanism. So in alchemy, you have this idea of purification, whether it's the metals or the alchemist's soul and the crucible of God's judgment. Both were part of transmutation and also part of Puritanism and alchemy. So in accord with Calvinist theology, alchemical success could not be achieved solely through self-effort. It was completely dependent on the will of God. So you had this aspect where they were not claiming that it was them who was performing these acts. It was purely God's will. Yet Edward Taylor, a Puritan minister and alchemist and poet from Westfield, Massachusetts, he used alchemy as an allegory in his poetry for the process of attaining grace. I think you can see this in alchemical artwork, and certainly in alchemical stories and other poetry, but this was a little bit more specific because it's not geared towards other alchemists. It's strictly for regular people, his congregation or other Puritans. The belief in the microcosm-macrocosm relationship very much meshed with puritanical beliefs in prodigies and portents and prophecies and things of that nature. So it wasn't at all out of line, the Hermetic philosophy. And the idea of primordial wisdom or mankind sort of recovering his birthright, returning to the Garden of Eden, is seen as a sort of a spiritual act through the study of natural philosophy. And that was also shared by Puritans and alchemists. So they had a lot of points in common, but it was not always hand-in-glove relationship. At times when there was any kind of political or economic tension, social tension, the alchemists were immediately suspect. of course, because they were different. They were practicing something that was not understood by pretty much anybody who wasn't practicing it. So it became viewed by the Puritan orthodoxy as potentially subversive. Not definitely, but maybe. And then we have a really interesting relationship between alchemy and the philosophies around magic, which are very closely related. Certainly in our minds today, they're very closely related, but in these times, not as much. Remember, they thought of alchemy as science. There wasn't the experimentation and the observable nature of the building blocks of matter in the same way as you had with alchemy. In Prospero's America, Woodward states that the Puritan intellectuals made clear distinctions between natural magic, which they saw as using natural, divinely inspired means to manipulate the occult forces believed to influence change in the natural world, and diabolic magic, which they saw as manipulation over those same forces with the aid of the devil or demons. So natural magic was widely accepted by those who were educated and pious enough to understand it. But diabolic magic was not accepted and was vehemently prohibited. So the medical alchemy of this time with religious overtones was connected with natural magic because the alchemists would augment their laboratory operations with Kabbalistic prayers and astrological timings. And alchemists were known to have a heavy interest in these subjects, and we know this strictly from the titles in their libraries. Leonard Hoare and Cotton Mather, in particular, had an expansive view of the range of occult studies permissible to the Puritan elite. Even if they didn't necessarily believe it was permissible, they still probably had the books in their library. Newman in Gehennical Fire argues that this natural magic approach is actually more attributable to what he sees as an opposed alchemical school during this time, which was represented by Thomas Vaughan, the Welsh alchemist, and he was the one that produced the first English translation of the Rosicrucian manifestos. So, and he sees the alchemy of Winthrop and Starkey as more Helmontian medical alchemy and less about the spiritual pursuits. To me, this is a new argument that I'm not really familiar with before I read his book, but interesting nonetheless. So I want to talk a little bit about the alchemists and the witch trials. Connecticut actually led the way as the most aggressive colony for prosecuting witches. They were responsible for 11 hangings before 1663. But then something happened that changed their approach to dealing with suspected witches, causing a moderation and then elimination of the executions altogether. And what that was the involvement of John Winthrop Jr., the governor, and his associates who were practicing alchemists. His knowledge of the occult and his medical expertise helped him provide authority when he was called on to adjudicate these trials. And again, I'm sorry, but indulge me with a long quote here from Woodward in his book, Prospero's America. He says, analyzing how Connecticut was transformed so rapidly from the colony most likely to execute witches to a colony without witchcraft trials highlights the prominence in colonial society of a group of occult philosophers, Puritan ministers, and magistrates who pursued knowledge of the unseen forces at work in the natural world through the study of alchemy, alchemical medicine, and natural magic. Led by Connecticut Governor John Winthrop Jr. and the alchemist minister Gershom Bulkeley, These magi among the elect possessed both a specialized knowledge of magic and the political authority to play a decisive role in reversing elite attitudes towards witchcraft prosecutions. Their leniency towards witchcraft suspects was based not on skepticism regarding magic's efficacy, but rather on their intellectual understanding of the magical arts witches were accused of practicing. It is to Winthrop and his understanding of the role of occult forces in the operations of nature, not to the arrival of modern scientific thinking, that Connecticut's sudden and sustained reluctance to prosecute witches must be attributed.
So they looked at it and they said, I know what magic is, and they're not doing magic.
Exactly.
You saw a simple folk remedy being used and said, oh, well, that's just simple natural magic. That's what she probably learned it from her grandmother. That's perfectly fine. No diabolism going on there.
And I think the other thing to remember is natural magic. When they say natural magic here, and they're studying and practicing natural magic, and it's okay. I think this is the natural magic we'd find in the Book of Solomon the King, concerning angels primarily, and other systems of angelic magic that involve creation of magical weapons or implements, of talismans, using timings, knowledge of Hebrew and Greek, knowledge of geometry to create the sigils. So there was a lot of background education involved in this, and I think the people they saw being put up for trial were, a lot of times widows who had property, or somebody had a grudge against a neighbor, and the evidence didn't bear out that they were doing, any kind of magic, whether it was natural magic or the diabolic, where, the lesser key of Solomon, goetic pacts, things of that nature. To me, this raises a lot of questions, because the scholarship on the Salem witch trials oftentimes does not really consider this evidence of the judges in these trials and how intricately they understood the subject of magic and alchemy and what they were presented with as evidence. A lot of times the books will look at different explanations for why they were being prosecuted, or different explanations for why maybe altered states of consciousness were being experienced or strange things were happening. But I think 4 questions arise that should be addressed. Did Mather and Stoughton allow spectral evidence because of their familiarity with natural magic, specifically in the Salem witch trials? They allowed what they called spectral evidence in these trials. If they're familiar with magic and they believe they understand it, why did they agree that this should be evidence introduced in the trial? Especially when a lot of modern scholars don't even consider the possibility that magic is a reality in the first place. Second question I had was there conduct during the trials, and by this I mean Mather and Stoughton, the judges, was their conduct or their belief in the guilt of the accused affected by their personal experience? I want to say that it had to have been. If they had extensive experience in natural magic, wouldn't that affect their judgment in the case? The third question, why was the outcome in Salem so different from the outcomes in Connecticut if those adjudicating these trials shared so many of the same beliefs about magic? To me, that suggests that the circumstances were different.
But Winthrop he wasn't here. Right?
No, he wasn't. He didn't take part in the Salem trials at all. from what I've read, it certainly seems like a number of people were executed from the Salem trials that it doesn't look like they had any involvement in any kind of witchcraft at all, even if it was suspect. And there was, I think, a lot of evidence that there was that people involved had undergone severe trauma with some Indian attacks that had occurred prior to this whole witchcraft craze. And I don't think that's really looked at enough in the analysis. My personal experience tells me that when people are subjected to severe trauma, especially children, later on you tend to have some kind of psychic or magical or some kind of repercussions, whether those are something that they endeavor to develop and nurture as abilities, or whether that's something that manifests as an unwanted phenomenon. I think it can be both. And the fourth big question I had was, why were Mather and Stoughton not skeptical about the possibility of real witchcraft in the same manner as Winthrop? Now, again, that suggests that the evidence that they were presented with made them think that they were seeing some kind of diabolical magic taking place. But when I look at the evidence, I don't really see it in the scholarship and the analysis of that. But, it's hard to go back that many years and really understand what was taking place. So probably an event that could still use more digging into.
Is the implication that maybe they were feeling something too? Or experiencing something?
I think the implication is that they may have believed that there was some actual sorcery or magic taking place. The evidence really doesn't suggest it, but the evidence is also, seen through the eyes of all of these scholars and generations of scholars. So it's, and I don't think any of them come at it from a point of view that says, yes, natural magic and philosophy is a real thing, and
unless they were going against Winthrop, trying to set a precedent that Winthrop is indeed practicing more the dark arts, and they want to make a statement against that. It's an interesting take.
It's maybe possible. I didn't see anything that told me that they were disagreed with his point of view, but that's certainly possible. The one thing that made me not think that, but it's hard to say because, I think we're much more literal today than people were in ages past. So when Cotton Mather eulogizes Winthrop the Younger as Hermes Christianus, is he, to your point, is he really praising him, or is there some veiled derision in that epithet? I don't know. Maybe there is. Maybe as a modern person in 2013, I'm not, subtle enough to perceive that, but who knows? It's possible. So one thing that seems to stand out, aside from the witch trials, is Winthrop and his alchemical colleagues didn't really question whether alchemy was scientific or whether it was really consistent with Puritan values. They thought it was progressive, intellectual, and immensely practical, but also spiritual. And they saw themselves as enlightened and hoped to achieve scientific advances that were of practical value and of a more eternal value, I guess you could say. And a lot of this modern research, I think, has also tried to restore alchemy to more realistic context, of where it is in the history of science and its importance of that. One of the things I saw when doing this paper was the huge impact that alchemy as a practice in general had on the American colonies, on New England itself. And I think just that quote about New London being the medical mecca, I think kind of illustrates that point to how much of an impact it had. So these two books, Gehennical Fire and Prospera's America, they're really good academic works. The negatives I have about this book is I feel like it reduces alchemy to a precursor of chemistry too much. He acknowledges the spiritual dimension, but that is like a veil laid over it, so it's acceptable to the community almost, because the theologians and the politicians are kind of in bed together. I don't know that that's really the case, but that's kind of how it's presented here. The other issue I have, and I don't know that I have an academic leg to stand on in terms of this, but he asserts again that Starkey is Philolethes. After Starkey moved to England in 1650, promising alchemist, he ended up broke and went to debtor's prison twice. So to me, I start to question, number one, the alchemy. From what I've been led to understand in the esoteric study of laboratory alchemy, it is in fact possible to transmute metals. If he was the master adept that so many claim, how in the world did he end up in debtor's prison twice? So he died during the plague, I think, in the 1660s. Again, if he's a master alchemist, how does he die, at a relatively young age of illness? Granted, I'm asking these questions somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I think accepting that Starkey is Philolethes also, by implication, you have to question whether the alchemical tradition as presented in the Western esoteric tradition is valid. Because if it's valid, Starkey can't be Philolethes. I know that's kind of a bold assertion. It may be like a false dialectic, but I feel like if what the alchemical tradition asserts as real, then this guy can't be Philolethes.
Isn't there also a claim that he could have been Thomas Vaughan?
Yeah. Thomas Vaughan also wrote as Eugenius Philolethes, which is a different Philolethes. And Vaughan actually died in an alchemical incident. So that's my main issue with the book, I think, is I want to have this kind of romantic belief that the alchemical tradition is valid on some level. Newman kind of breaks that apart a little bit, so I don't like that on a personal level. Woodward's book, Prospera's America, is a lot easier to swallow, I think, because it's still reductionist in looking at alchemy from more of a medical or a mercantile point of view, but I think he appreciates the mystery tradition a little bit more, although he may not place any more value in it than Newman does. I feel like he's not making a claim, that kind of shatters the whole myth apart.
It seems like with John Winthrop, it might be easier to make the case that his way of life, his success, the way he was received by others was indicative of what that philosophy held within it.
Yeah.
Whether alchemy is a magical practice that produces gold or not,
right.
The Hermetic background philosophy, the Rosicrucianism, that idea of being in service to others with your industry and science,
right,
made him a heroic character.
That's true.
It would have been an easier story to tell.
That's a good point. And looking at it in that context, you could say Starkey was a master. If he did really produce these texts, regardless of how he ended up, like he did transmit invaluable knowledge to countless practitioners around the world, and probably is still doing so today. I got a book just a couple years ago where a practicing laboratory alchemist he's going through the key foundational texts that are crucial to his practice, and one of them is Philalet's Secrets Revealed. Another one is Basil Valentine's Triumphant Chariot of Antimony, and I think the third is a Paracelsus text. So he's certainly held in high regard. I wanted to also finish off. I just got this in the mail today, coincidentally enough. David Shoemaker's Living Thelema, Practical Guide to Attainment in Aleister Crowley's System of Magic. And, it's a really excellent book. I've only had a chance to crack it open a little bit, but I wanted to read this section because he does a really brilliant job of talking about alchemy and ideas about alchemy in modern times and how they relate to Thelema and just life in general. We may imagine that the ancient alchemists were fascinated by the creative and transformative act itself. Humanity was on the threshold of discovering the underlying principles of matter, the facts of its nature, and the laws of its combination and action. And yet, while on the quest for this factual knowledge, they touched on many governing principles of the mind and the soul. Just as humanity was coming to terms with its ability to create and define reality, its divine birthright, these truths were echoed in the frontiers of its science. My propositions in this present discussion apply to humanity as a whole. It has always been the case across the course of human evolution that mystics and other extraordinary seekers are the droplets on the crest of the wave of progress and reach their conclusions long before the critical mass of humanity. What I'm discussing here, on the contrary, is a much broader process. It is the evolution of collective human consciousness played out on the field of psychological projections onto the frontiers of scientific inquiry. The unanswered mysteries of contemporary science become the hooks on which our society, usually unconsciously, hangs its aspirations, ideals, and fears, its questions about the mysteries of life, and its strivings for meanings and understandings. By this definition, we are all alchemists. And he does a wonderful job of really relating alchemical symbolism also to this. And I know Crowley, in many of his works, uses alchemical symbolism, and I believe he was actually trained as a chemist at some point himself. Thelema, I think, has successfully adopted the alchemical symbolism in a modern context, whereas I see the alchemical symbolism in the past very much sort of fit into whatever religion happened to be the dominant form at that time and place, whether it's Christianity or Islam.
Well, there's Jung's work on.
There's Jung's work, which is
very,
very different.
Psycho-spiritual.
Yeah.
And having now had a chance to review the Red Book, it's pretty obvious that the man was an actual practitioner and magician. But even just reading his works on alchemy and the respect that he had for it as a spiritual tradition, when we didn't know that about him, there's a far deeper, from a modern perspective, appreciation of what alchemy could be, apart from the joke of, it's people trying to turn rocks into gold.
Yeah. It's something I always found interesting, that, people claim that, this is alchemy and that's not alchemy.
Right.
And, I came across this Paracelsus text, I forget exactly which one, but in it he talks about anybody who creates or transforms anything at all is an alchemist. You know, the guy that turns grapes into wine is an alchemist, and the person that turns sheep's wool into cloth is an alchemist.
And milking coffee beans into your cafe latte, the barista at Starbucks, is an alchemist.
Yeah,
and certainly an artist as well.
So if Paracelsus says they're an alchemist, that's good enough for me.
Right.
I wonder what the country doctor in early New England, what books that person would have, or what information that person would possess, and how that related. I mean, even just things on the side related to this daily practical treatment of people.
It also makes it easier to understand a character like Pascal Beverly Randolph existing in this movie that you usually think of as being so dry of what we in our modern 20th century, 21st century viewpoint we see as subversive esotericism. It was a little more fluid back then, and you don't really see that reflected in the history, unless you really dig.
So that's basically the presentation. I don't know if you have any other questions or comments, or...
I'm curious, what do you think led to alchemy going back underground after that point? I mean, was it really just a matter of, you were talking about there being a Harvard thesis in like 1767 still.
Yeah, 1771.
Even that further. So is it really just that 50, 60 years later, we're in the middle of the Industrial Revolution and progress has happened in a way that makes medicine and industry look to other answers, and that connection between Puritanism has died down and gone? I mean, is that what you see as being responsible, or?
I think a lot of it has to do with Robert Boyle in England and the advent of modern chemistry. I mean, they basically disavowed alchemy as a science, and there's a number of problems with it, right? I mean, it's not accessible to anybody. You have to be taught by someone who knows what they're doing. And there's no agreed upon language. The symbols are all over the place. They mean different things in different books. The language is veiled. It's all like the Twilight language. It didn't help anybody achieve any kind of success unless they already knew what they were doing. Is that whole idea it's God's will. God will reveal it to you when you've made sufficient progress. And there's the whole idea in the alchemical tradition of Elias, the artist, who will appear to the earnest and worthy practitioner to assist them along the path. And this is analogous to Elijah the prophet, or some mysterious secret chief who will grace you with their presence and help you along.
The ghost of Timothy Leary. I mean, Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Exactly, yeah. So I think there's all this mystical aspect to it, and then the religious aspect. So I think they just wanted to jettison all of the parts of it that they couldn't get their hands around and standardize.
I guess the other thing I was kind of curious about, I mean, we're sitting here in Salem, Massachusetts, so the appeal of, we're talking about colonial New England is cool, but was there any other part of America where alchemical trends could have come in?
Yeah.
And of course the reality is that pretty much was America at the time, was New England, so it's hard to, in that era, unless there was maybe...
There was other parts of the colonies.
Arabic-influenced Spanish people in some parts, or just in the mid-Atlantic. I mean,
the mid-Atlantic is the only other region I've found where you had the German immigrants.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with Johannes Kelpius and his Woman of the Wilderness.
I don't think so.
And Ephrata Cloister. So you had these German, they're called pietists. I don't know if you're familiar with pietism You've read Molinos, right?
Yeah, they used to make pies and share with
Yes,
the community.
right. Yes, among other things. So
Into a mathematical equation.
they're labeled as pietists, but Kelpius and his followers, I think there is evidence that they were connected with Neo-Rosicrucian circles in Germany, in Heidelberg, and they also were connected with Philadelphian groups like Jane Lead in England, and they felt persecuted in Germany. The Lutheran Church was not as open and forgiving as we might like to think it should be. And so they wanted to travel to Pennsylvania where they could live and practice their form of religion in freedom and not be persecuted for it. So they, as a group, formed a chapter of perfection. And then they went to England, and on the eve of their departure, the group leader died. I think it was a guy named Zimmerman. And so Kelpius, who was another child prodigy, went to University of Heidelberg for his doctoral program at 16. He assumes leadership of the group, and they sail to the New World, and there's a copy of his diary, I think, and for the journey, and he's got his little astrological symbols in the margins for each entry, and he was known.
Diary.
Yeah, so they did natural angel magic.
Yeah.
They were known to practice alchemy and meditation. They had an observatory with a circle cross on top of it to measure the heavens. Supposedly when Kelpius died, his instructions to whoever his successor was in the group was, and he died young, I think at age 35 of tuberculosis, because they were living in these caves as hermits. And he instructed his successor to take his chest of belongings and toss it in the river. So supposedly the guy was okay, and he was don't open it, whatever you do, do not open it, just throw it in.
Did you?
And supposedly the guy told him, he was going to do it, he's to take care of it. And then, Kelpius is on his deathbed, and he's you haven't done it yet. And the guy's how do you know? He's you have to throw it, you have to get rid of it. So he went and he tossed it in the river, and supposedly something caught fire, and there was some kind of sparks, and who knows? I mean, it's not really that well documented, but it's an anecdotal story.
And this is where we got in, and it was the Philadelphia experiment.
Right. But a lot of the people who lived there with him at this woman in the wilderness commune, they ended up going to Ephrata Cloister. There was a guy, Johann Conrad Beisel, who's another German immigrant who actually came to Pennsylvania because he wanted to join up with Kelpius and his group, but Kelpius had already died at that point, so Beisel formed his own commune called Ephrata, and a lot of the people who were with Kelpius joined up, and they ended up forming what they called the Brotherhood of Zion. They built an octagonal temple.
Okay.
They were into Egyptian Freemasonry and alchemy, and supposedly what they would do...
So they were just nut jobs, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, they would take the candidate for whatever degree, I guess they would do this for whatever degree it was, and they'd have a specific alchemical medicine or substance, and they'd send the person out in the woods and give them this medicine, and that was,
good times.
Basically, yeah. Because these things your teeth fall out, all your hair falls out and then grows back, and supposedly this is the stuff they were into. So, and then there was actually a guy that came to live there, not in the commune, but near it, because he knew they were practicing alchemists. I can't think of his name, but I want to say he had worked with Sendigovius or something. Supposedly someone who had, if they hadn't achieved the Philosopher's Stone, they had achieved the powder of projection. So they should have been able to transmute metals, but, again, it gets kind of hazy. Well, thank you again.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.